Noita is a good game, but like many games, it has issues. Now I want to preface this by saying that I think Noita is a fun game, and if you like sandbox and roguelike games, you should give it a try, and that this video will spoil some of the game's surprises if you care about that. Now that being said, the crux of my argument is that Noita, while a good game, could be far better, and due to design decisions that feel like a mixture between carelessness and misguidance, the game will forever be held back from attaining what it could be. Let's start with the good aspects of the game, of which there are many. First of which is the game's world, which is quite expansive and varied, with plenty of activities scattered around the map. The overworld is a nice reprieve from the game's hardships, and gives a nice open area for the player to mess with things in, such as spells or the game's physics. Additionally, there's many features scattered around for the player to get involved with, and I want to give credit where it's due. The world is designed in a great way for the player to naturally want to wander around the surface, and just as varied as the main game. The levels, each one separated by a pulley mountain to give a nice place to tinker and to plan ahead. Each level is different from the last, and comes with an ever-increasing variety of opponents, as well as their threat levels. Second is the game's primary selling point, the wand tinkering. It's fun, incredibly so. It adds a significant amount of depth to the game, and allows a lot of player expression. This aspect of the game is further propped up by the hundreds of spells the game provides, many of which are unlocked as you explore the world, giving a tangible, persistent reward to encourage interaction with the expansive world. Thirdly is the secondary selling point, and the most visually striking, the particle simulation. It makes the large world feel alive, and adds a lot of nuance to traversal. It's like having the game powder toy times 100. You can blow up paths, burn through objects, melt a hole in the ground, and much more. And the falling sand side of the game integrates fairly well with a rigid body simulation running concurrently, letting you kick around explosive boxes and other props. And moreover, there's dozens of materials, all having slightly different properties, effects, and interactions with other materials. Now, with all the good out of the way, let's get into the bad, first of which is the game's most prevalent issue, the abysmal balance. But first, I think it's important to talk about why balance is important, since there's a somewhat widespread belief that balance doesn't matter in PvE or single-player games. Simply put, balance is important because it keeps the game interesting. If the player is too disadvantaged, then the game ends up being frustrating. And, on the other side, if a player is too powerful, then the game feels boring and makes accomplishments feel hollow. A game having poor balance harms the replay value too, because a player will, on either end of the spectrum, ask themselves, what is the point? So, with that in mind, let's talk about Noita's balance. Now, as much as people like to say that the game is brutal and tough as nails, reality tells a different story. Indeed, the game is hard if you're new, because the game has a very steep learning curve, but once the curve is overcome, the game becomes piss easy. I think that the greatest example of the game's poor balance is polymorh, not necessarily because it of itself is the biggest problem, but rather it's a symptom of the game's shortcomings and how they're approached. Now, polymorh is bullshit incarnate. When under the effects of polymorh, you more or less lose all agency, being restricted to a very low amount of movement, with a very small amount of health, and dying in this state kills you. Polymorh is not interesting, nor is it fun, nor is it immediately obvious what does and doesn't give the effect. It almost feels like polymorh was manufactured to be as frustrating and unfair as possible, so that there's an easy out of the proclamation that the game lacks balance. A strategy which the community seems to be in support of, because anytime someone raises a point about the ridiculous power potential of the player, someone always brings up polymorh and how 1 pixel can end your whole run though, as if this were a good thing. Imagine getting a winning lottery ticket, only to get hit by a train the next day. This is Noita's balance, in context of polymorph's existence. This is balanced only in the most ostensive manner, though the most disappointing balance aspect is the game's bosses. They are all pushovers, in part because the player can fight them at any power level they want, also in part because they have modest health pools without exceptional damage or interesting moves. In fact, the hardest part about the game's bosses is actually finding them. Besides maybe 3 bosses, you'll spend most of your time actually trying to find them, assuming you don't relent and look up their locations online. And let's talk about the player's power for a moment. It gets way too high. A modest wand can easily do upwards of thousands of damage per second, and a min-maxed wand can easily get into 1,000,000 per shot. Being able to instantly disintegrate, well, anything really is, at first, fun. However, that fun quickly fades away until clearing a level becomes a chore, assuming you don't just dig through it and call it a day. On top of that, the player is able to effectively get infinite perks through the wonder that is Parallel Worlds and effectively infinite health through the Heart Mage exploit. And this isn't mentioning how many of the game's perks are, at best, worthless, and there's multiple perks that just break the game's balance on their own. The player, once they understand how the game operates, is very easily able to become a demigod of the world. And that gives a nice segue into the next topic, the game's reliance on metaknowlege. The game has a lot of secret content scattered around the map, much of which is considerably powerful. Indeed, the player can get well over 200,000 gold in a location that is guaranteed to spawn in the same place every game. The player can get health in guaranteed locations. The player can get spells and powerful wands in guaranteed locations. The only barrier to them is often knowing where they are and how to get them. These secrets, while very cool on a first find, absolutely break the game in subsequent runs, since now that you know where they are, you can get them 9 times out of 10. This also applies to many of the game's quests too, which are, on a good day, esoteric, and on a bad day, pure guesswork. This means that a player is left with 2 options. Either they organically experience the game, and are likely to miss out on well over half of what the game has to offer, or they data mine or use a wiki to find out everything and power game every run. And one thing I'd really like to talk about is the game's alchemy, and how poor it is. Not only is it reliant on heavy meta-knowledge and luck, but the way the game was made means that it's never really worth it to interact with the game's deeper falling sand simulation outside of a few exceptions. In Noita, there's 5, maybe 6 worthwhile materials, so let's go through them real quick. Water is the best material overall because it lets you put out fires and remove other stains, and is found in nearly every level and is in every holy mountain and makes more of itself with toxic sludge. Berserkium is a good way to increase damage output, but its crafting recipe requires that you have the fresh corpse of one of 2 enemies that can be only found in 3 of the game's levels, making it overall too tedious and restrictive to ever make on your own. Pheromone can be used to get infinite heals, but requires Berserkium to make, meaning that you're better off finding some rather than making it. Concentrated mana can supplement a wand's poor stats, and damages robotic enemies on contact. However, there's no way to actually make it. The only way you can get it is if you already have it, as it reacts with water to make more of itself. Acceleradium is a handy material that makes you faster, but also can't actually be crafted. All you can do is convert it into Levitadium or Hastium, which have similar effects. And alchemy is quite tedious for multiple reasons. For one, materials may react with their environment, or otherwise be hard to handle. Acid, for example, will readily eat away at the ground, and polymorphine is more or less impossible to pick up because touching it polymorphs you. A second reason is item management. The restriction to 4 item slots makes transporting a significant amount of reagents a chore, since you'll have to potentially take multiple trips, and the worst part is that there's a good chance your potions will smash open when you reload the area for some reason due to a weird entity physics bug. Alchemy feels completely pointless to undo intentionally because it requires so much luck and effort to get a product that, realistically, isn't that great. And by the end of it, you couldn't help but think of how you could have better spent your time doing anything else that would have been more productive. Of course, a big issue with the game, and a large reason for its terrible learning curve apart from lackluster descriptions, is that the game does not give players a space to properly experiment. Giving space for experimentation is a vital part to a game as open as Noita, yet the options don't really exist. In Minecraft, you can boot into creative mode and test out contraptions. In Oxygen Not Included, you can enable sandbox mode and make anything you want. In Team Fortress 2, you can start a local server and practice to your heart's content. But in Noita, you don't get any space to play, no room to breathe. Lacking this option, the player is discouraged from properly learning about the game, since taking any risks means putting your run in jeopardy. Noita would greatly benefit from a sandbox mode, yet no option exists. And even barring that, being able to have more than one run active at a time could be huge for experimentation. And as the final major issue, a majority of the game's content is largely meaningless in the confines of the game. That is to say, most of the game's content fails to extrinsically reward the player. For example, the bosses. Only about 5 of the 11 drop good items. Some of these items are so good that it's almost a requirement to fight them if you want to go for an extended run. The other bosses don't really drop anything meaningful, and are out of the way to the point where it's just not worth it to fight them. And what adds insult to injury is that the final boss, the intended endpoint of the game, doesn't drop anything good. And what's even stupider is that you don't actually have to beat it to win the game. Another example is the Sun Quest, which rewards with 2 mostly identical spells that aren't very practical to ever actually use. There's an unlock for conditional check spells, but none of the conditions are terribly useful except maybe 2 of them. The orbs scattered around the map are often out of the way and hard to find, and unlock spells that are, in general, not terribly useful, but at least you get a bit of extra health. The final thing I want to do is go over a lot of little things that all add up and compound on the game's existing issues. The tower is a cool concept as an endgame challenge, but in practice, you can just bypass it to collect the best wand in the game. Some spells have variants which operate in the same way and have no unique function, and the changes should just be their own modifier spells. Some spells have limited charges, and there's a perk that bypasses this restriction, except that many spells are still limited with this perk. However, Greek letter spells make this perk completely useless, and are additionally able to infinitely cast these previously limited spells. Healing is hard to come by, but once you come by, it's very easy to make unlimited, which poses the question of why it's hard to come by at all if you're able to, in most cases, heal to full each time. The game's end boss scales exponentially, which is dumb, but what's even dumber is that scales off a metric that is unrelated to player power, and no other boss in the game scales with the player at all. Parallel worlds aren't very interesting and just act as free perks more or less in a disposable side area. New Game Plus doesn't add any new content, and in fact, the New Game Plus world has less content. In conclusion, Noita has several issues that continually hold the game back, resulting in lowered replay value and uncompelling, boring gameplay. Many of these designs are issues that would be easy to solve, but whether it's because the developers are incompetent or simply don't care, nothing has ever been done to try to solve any of these problems.